Hello, and welcome back to Chapter 8 of the Assassination Simulation. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 8. Evie looked up at the rope dangling from the ceiling of the training center. A bead of sweat slid down her temple, and she unconsciously tapped a toe in nervous anticipation. Across the room from her, forming the second and third points of an equilateral triangle, Lubanzi and Haruto each stood in front of their own ropes. Each of them wore a headpiece to protect their brains from injury if they fell. Lubanzi grinned at her from across the room, mouthing something unintelligible, but clearly meant to be a taunt. Evie threw a rude gesture back at him, smiling despite her nerves. Claro stood between them at the triangle's center. She turned slowly, taking in each human. "On the count of 3, she yelled, holding up 3 of her 4 fingers. "Remember, there are only 2 flags. Whoever doesn't bring one back down to me gets an extra hour of sprints this evening. On your mark, get set, go!" Evie didn't need to be told twice. One of the few things all 3 humans could agree on was that sprints were the worst. She seized the rope in front of her and began hauling herself up. In the last 2 months, climbing ropes had become a familiar, everyday activity, and she quickly ascended up the 20-foot distance to the first platform. She dismounted, glancing across the room at Lubanzi and Haruto. Haruto was still climbing the rope, though he was almost at the top. Lubanzi was already making his way across the first obstacle. The first platform was narrow, about a foot wide and 15 feet long. More ropes, attached to the front and back of the platform, held it suspended in the air. It swayed back and forth ominously, and there were no handholds available to aid her crossing. That was fine, since they would only have slowed her down. This was another exercise that had scared the piss out of her the first time she had attempted it, but by now it was old news. She crouched low, keeping her weight centered, and quickly made her way forward across the platform. The aerial obstacle course was a few hundred feet long in total. Each assassin had their own path, 3 large spirals that came together at the center of the room above where Claro stood. Evie focused on running the course as quickly as she could. She jumped from platform to platform, climbed over and under different features, and ran along narrow balance beams. Some sections had to be navigated using only her hands, forcing her to dangle precariously over an uncomfortable drop, hoping her grip strength wouldn't fail before she reached the other side. But by now, muscles corded her forearms, and calluses replaced the blisters that had first covered her hands. She was familiar with this exercise. It was never exactly the same, but they had been running different variations of it for weeks now. However, this was the first time that they were doing so as a competition between the 3 humans, and the added pressure threatened to make her sloppy. As she neared the end of her spiral, she could see the small platform at its center, on which lay 2 small black flags. One last obstacle stood between her and her goal. There was a gap. It had to be at least 10 feet wide, and the only aid to cross the distance was a small hanging ring, suspended above her head halfway across. She landed on her second-to-last platform, and looked up to see Lubanzi across from her. The tall man reached the edge of his penultimate platform, leaned out, and casually caught the ring before his feet even left the ground. "No fucking fair," she shrieked at him as he easily swung himself across. He stuck his tongue out, flipped her off, grabbed a flag, and slid down another rope to land next to Claro. Evie glanced over to see where Haruto was. He was still 1 obstacle back, but approaching quickly. Evie hopped up and down twice, psyching herself up for the jump, then went for it. It wasn't actually that far, but it was high enough to make her stomach plummet before her fingers successfully wrapped around the ring. Relieved, she swung easily to the central platform, grabbed the second flag, and moved to the rope. She didn't make it. Haruto crashed into her, ripping the flag from her hand. He must have made the final jump without stopping to gauge the distance as she had. Evie screamed as she fell. The last thing she saw as she plummeted from the platform was Haruto looking down at her. His face was its normal hard mask, but the edges of his mouth twitched into a small, satisfied grimace before he turned away towards the rope. A sharp burst of pain spiked through her, and the world went black. Evie snapped awake. She was in a resurrection chamber. No matter how many times she experienced them, the machine still made her uneasy. She quickly extracted herself, looking around to see Vor, accompanied by Claro and Hat, perched on the trainer's arm. The second Evie exited the pod, Hat hopped across to her. "Are you blind or just stupid?" he snapped at her. "You could see that fucker coming from a mile away." "I didn't think he'd get there that fast." Evie closed her eyes as the memory of the last few seconds returned. "And I didn't realize that he would push me off a ledge just to win a stupid race." She turned to Claro, whose grin did nothing to ease her frustration. "Are you really going to let him keep doing this? This is the third time he's landed Lubanzi or I in the medbay in the last 2 weeks. This is getting out of hand. Plus he cheated. I had the flag. Fair and square." In hindsight, she should have expected Haruto to pull something like this. However, the last 2 injuries he had inflicted had happened during sparring matches between him and Lubanzi. There was a big difference between getting a little carried away in a fight and intentionally pushing someone off a ledge 20 feet in the air. "I didn't say the first 2 to grab the flags win," Claro replied. "I said the first 2 who bring the flags back down to me. Haruto won. Take it as a learning experience, Evie, and don't think something as trivial as a broken leg is going to get you out of sprints this evening." Evie shifted her weight, looking down at her leg. It was a little sore, but if Claro hadn't told her, she wouldn't have known it had been broken. The realization stoked her growing frustration. "Claro, this is just going to keep escalating. First, he broke one of Lubanzi's fingers. A few days later, he broke his goddamn collarbone. Now he shoved me off a ledge. What does he have to do before you start taking his actions seriously? There is something wrong with him, and one of you needs to do something about it." Claro's grin didn't waver, but the edges of her mouth tightened. "Oh, I'm sorry, Evie. I forgot that we are here for a fun retreat. Is Haruto being a big bully to you and Lubanzi? Do you need the grown-ups to step in and tell him to leave you 2 alone?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm. Evie didn't respond, and was the first to break eye contact. She took a few deep breaths, calming herself, before she said anything else that would dig the hole deeper. She understood what the other woman was saying, but Haruto's attitude towards her and Lubanzi still grated on her. They were all on the same team. She thought learning to work together would be more valuable than a one-sided dick-measuring competition, as Hat had put it in the privacy of their room. Once it was clear that Evie wouldn't push the issue further, Claro turned to leave the medbay. "I'll see you at hour 19 for sprints, Evie. Don't be late." She calmly disappeared out the door. Evie glanced down at Hat. He rolled his tiny eyes at her before turning to Vor. The medic had remained silent for the entire confrontation, but now that Claro was gone, he smiled at Evie sympathetically. "Tough luck, Evie," Vor said. "Just try to remember that it really doesn't matter. There isn't anything he can do that we can't fix, except severe brain trauma, of course, which is why we make you wear head guards for some exercises." They didn't wear the head guards when sparring because they blocked the human's peripheral vision. But Claro made it clear to all 3 assassins that they would not tolerate any blows to the head, even accidental ones. There was a quiet knock at the doorframe leading into the medbay, and Lubanzi poked his head around the corner. Worry creased his forehead, but when he caught sight of Evie standing and talking to Vor, he visibly relaxed. He walked up to them, offering Evie a plate of food full of large, Honrad dumplings. She took it gratefully, but before she could grab one, Hat jumped down from her shoulder to her forearm, snatched the biggest dumpling from the center of the plate, and flew off into the corner. Amaya, perched on Lubanzi's shoulder, shot both humans a quick, guilty look, then took off after him. Evie shot an exasperated smile at Lubanzi as she gratefully took a bite of one of the remaining dumplings. The 2 producers might be intelligent, biological surveillance cyborgs, but they were still pigeons. "Evie, I'm so glad to see you're okay," Lubanzi said. "That was horrible. One of your bones was sticking out of your leg, and you got blood everywhere. From now on, I vote we let me handle Haruto's beatings. I take them much more gracefully than you do." Lubanzi's attempt to make light of the situation did not fool Evie. He used humor as a shield, in the same way that she used her internal walls. She knew him well enough now to see how much Haruto's actions were affecting him. That was what Claro, Vor, and the other Scanarians didn't realize. They might heal the physical wounds, but the mental strain on Lubanzi was becoming more obvious. The young man tried to hide it, but he was getting progressively more skittish around Haruto. It was whittling away at his confidence, preventing him from progressing as quickly as he needed to. "Don't waste too much energy worrying about it," Vor said. "The weapons ceremony is in a week. After that, you won't be spending any time working together, not for a while at least. You'll be too busy mastering your individual weapons." Evie and Lubanzi both groaned in unison. The weapons ceremony had become a bitter joke between them. They still didn't know what it was. The way the Scanarians talked about it made it sound like it had more significance than a simple ceremony to return their weapons. Hat and Amaya couldn't fill them in, not until Azur broached the subject first. However, Azur had been notably absent. The lectures about the Understanding, the Sim, and the Honrad hadn't resumed since the producers had entered the picture, and the lack of information was becoming difficult to ignore. Vor looked back and forth between the two humans, non-existent eyebrows raised questioningly. "Sorry," Evie said. "Touchy subject. They still haven't briefed us about the weapons ceremony. It's coming up so fast. I wish we had more details. But I guess Azur wants it to be a surprise." Vor's forehead creased in confusion. "Azur really hasn't gone over the ceremony with you yet?" he asked skeptically. Evie and Lubanzi shook their heads. Vor looked shocked. "She really should have. This is why she usually has one of her underlings handle onboarding. She doesn't have time to do it properly, in addition to everything else on her plate." Evie's eyebrow went up. She had never thought about who, exactly, Azur was. "What do you mean?" she asked around a mouthful of dumpling. "What else does she do?" "Azur is the director of the entire Scanarian branch of the Assassination simulation," Vor responded. "To my knowledge, she hasn't taken part in assassin onboarding in hundreds of years at least. Not since she took over the department." Evie and Lubanzi stared at Vor. "Then what is she doing here with us?" Lubanzi asked. Vor shrugged. "She claimed it was because she felt like she was losing touch with what makes the assassination simulation great, that she needed some time back in the field. If I'm being honest, though, I think it's probably a political stunt of some kind. Her brother, the Scanarian emissary to the Understanding, is currently running for re-election. This probably has something to do with that, though don't ask me how. It's a bummer for you three, though." Evie wasn't sure what the Scanarian emissary to the Understanding was, but it sounded important. She didn't like that they might be inadvertently taking part in alien politics outside of the Sim, but there wasn't much they could do about it. "In that case, do you think you could fill us in?" Lubanzi asked the medic. Vor looked a little uncomfortable and considered for a moment, before shrugging. "Someone has to tell you. The weapons ceremony is your introduction to the Understanding. It helps to generate interest and build anticipation. To start, we have to prove that each of you and your weapons are eligible for participation by showing everyone's origin stories." Lubanzi paled noticeably. "What do you mean, our origin stories?" "Your murders, of course," Vor responded cheerfully, not noticing Lubanzi's discomfort. "The Earth Pigeons keep a close eye out for prospective candidates. They film any incident that seems like it might qualify someone to make sure that we have recordings of the events. Those recordings will be aired and reviewed by a panel that votes on your eligibility." Vor finally noticed Lubanzi's discomfort. "Don't worry," he said, smiling reassuringly at the younger man. "It's just a formality. No one ever gets voted off at this stage." Vor misunderstood the source of Lubanzi's worry. Evie didn't know what he had done to put himself here, but she knew it haunted him. Many times in the last few months, Hat had woken her in the middle of the night after receiving a message from Amaya. They would sneak down the hall to Lubanzi's room to find him curled, shaking and sobbing quietly in his bed. Evie would sit with him, stroking his back like she would have for a child, until he finally calmed down enough to go back to sleep. She wanted to help him, but whenever she tried to bring it up, he would dig in his heels and laugh it off, insisting he was fine. Evie watched Lubanzi closely. Vor's words had rattled him. Vor, oblivious to the turmoil his words had caused, continued. "After they have voted you eligible, we will present your weapons to you. I assume you know about the modifications." He stopped and eyed them until Evie shook her head. "I'm going to have to talk to someone about this. It's really inexcusable. We optimize your existing weapon and give it 2 enhancements. The changes vary depending on the weapon and have to be approved by the sniffers. You have access to the current season's episodes, right? They nodded, and Vor looked visibly relieved. Oh, thank goodness. I was worried there for a second. Though I can't imagine your producers would have let that one fly. Have you both seen Celia then? The scary buff lady. Let's use her as an example. We onboarded Celia after she stabbed one of her coworkers with an industrial hot knife. I have been told this is a relatively common tool on Earth, used for crafting and cutting foam. It's a knife that gets hot. You get the idea. Anyway, when we hired her, we took custody of her weapon. First, we optimized it. It was a flimsy piece of junk that only went up to about 500 or 600 degrees. The number and unit Vor used was different, but Evie's mind automatically converted the figure to Fahrenheit. It was another neat trick she had gained from her neural surgery. After optimization, it was much longer and sturdier and could get about 4 times as hot. Its 2 enhancements were the sheath around her wrist, which allows it to extend and retract as needed, and a radiation feature that allows it to cut much quicker and more effectively through materials it wouldn't be able to otherwise. Like glass, Evie said, remembering the first episode of The Sims she had ever watched. Exactly, Vor responded, smiling. He looked between Evie and Lubanzi to see if they had questions. It seemed pretty straightforward to Evie, and she was relieved that someone had finally explained it to them. Evie took another bite of dumpling, wondering what enhancements they might give to an umbrella as she chewed. Her mind went immediately to Mary Poppins, and the thought of using an umbrella to fly around an alien planet made her inwardly giggle. She looked back at Lubanzi. He was still paler than normal, but he was trying to hide it. Between you two and me, it honestly surprised us that all our requested modifications got approved this time around, Vor said. I'm friends with some of our engineers. You 3 lucked out. We are all incredibly excited to see what you can do with your weapons once you receive them. Thanks for breaking the rules, Vor, Hat said from behind Evie, landing heavily on her shoulder. He had bits of dumpling stuck around his beak, which he promptly wiped off on her shoulder before she could stop him. A second later, Amaya, whose face was spotless, landed on Lubanzi and gave his ear an affectionate nibble. He reached up and absently scratched the bird's head, relaxing a little. Vor nodded. I'll have a talk with some people. If Azur can't keep up, we really should get someone else to fill in for her. He bustled back to his desk, waving goodbye. Evie and Lubanzi took the hint and left the medbay together. Hopefully, he's right about the sparring being over for a while after the weapons ceremony, Lubanzi muttered to Evie. I think we can get through 1 more week. Evie flinched. If there had been any wood on the Scanarian ship around them, she would have knocked on it. A few days passed before the trainers put Lubanzi and Haruto back in a sparring ring together. Evie had been spending some time in the evenings with Lubanzi, working with him on how he could better hold his own against the older, smaller man. Lubanzi had a massive reach advantage, and Evie had been showing him how to take advantage of it. She didn't think Lubanzi could beat Haruto, not yet, but she was hoping he would at least be able to keep him at a distance and prevent him from doing any actual damage. The match started well enough. Evie was nearby doing bodyweight exercises with Claro and kept an eye on the 2 men. Lubanzi was holding his own, better than he had before, and Haruto was finding it difficult to get close enough to land a hard strike. Evie smiled to herself, and after watching for a few minutes, turned away and focused back on what she was doing with Claro. A jarring, wet crunch echoed across the training arena, followed by a painful, gurgling cry. Evie spun around to see Lubanzi stumbling back, clutching at his throat. Haruto stood a few feet away from him, an expression of triumph on his face. She couldn't tell what was wrong, but as she watched, Lubanzi fell to his knees. Horrible sounds came from his throat, and he seemed unable to breathe normally. Evie ran to him, sliding to his side in time to catch him as he fell over the rest of the way. He coughed, spraying bloody spittle over the white floor. Now that she was closer, she could see what was wrong. Haruto had crushed his throat. Evie met Lubanzi's eyes. They were full of terror, pleading for help. She had seen that look before. in the eyes of the man back in Singapore, right before he died. She hugged Lubanzi to her chest, trying to offer some kind of comfort. "Help!" she screamed at the Scanarians behind her. Lubanzi's coach, Fermad, had walked over to Claro and was chatting with her. He looked mildly annoyed, and as Evie watched, Claro shook her head and chuckled. Lubanzi tried to say something, but all that came out was more blood. Evie turned her head, looking over at Haruto. For the briefest of moments, she thought she saw a flicker of worry, maybe even remorse, cross Haruto's face. She must have imagined it, though. His expression quickly returned to its normal, stony mask. He turned and walked away, meeting his trainer at the edge of the mat. She turned back to Claro and Fermad, who were casually making their way over. "Please, you have to do something." She felt tears trickling from her eyes. "He can't breathe. That asshole crushed his throat." Lubanzi's eyes closed, and he mercifully slipped into unconsciousness. His labored attempts at breathing were growing weaker. "It was a good kick," said Fermad. "Lubanzi should have blocked it." Evie stared up at him, incredulous. "Relax, Evie," Claro said. "Vor and his team should be here any second. Lubanzi will be fine." Right as she spoke, Evie heard footsteps coming from the door. It was Vor and another Scanarian Evie didn't know. Vor, at least, looked concerned. They hurried over with a stretcher and carefully lifted Lubanzi up and onto it. His breathing was almost undetectable as they hurriedly took him away. "Anyway, where were we?" Claro continued. She turned and headed back to the equipment they had been using before Lubanzi's injury. Evie realized Claro wanted to pick up where they had left off, as if nothing had happened. Evie didn't move. She tried to breathe, tried to remain calm. "What is wrong with you?" she heard herself scream. Anger boiled inside of her, trying to work its way out. She fought it, but some slipped through the cracks. "I told you this would happen. You need to do something about him." She gestured at Haruto. Claro flicked her tongue in a Scanarian eye roll. "Evie, we talked about this," she said. Her voice was soft, but something in her tone made the hairs on the back of Evie's neck stand on end. "Lubanzi will be fine. You're overreacting. You need to learn that stuff like this doesn't matter, not like it did back on Earth. Haruto did what he had to do to win the match. That's all." "That's bullshit!" Evie spat. She knew she should back down, that Claro was technically correct, but every fiber in her being disagreed with her. Haruto could have won without crushing his fucking throat. He has never needed to resort to the level of violence that he does. He chooses to. "So what?" Claro responded. Her voice was icy, and she glared down at Evie. "He's an assassin. You're all assassins. Brutality can be effective, and honestly, it gets great ratings. Why do you think we hire murderers, Evie?" Evie stood silently, opening and closing her mouth, trying to find words. "Instead of bitching at me, why don't you go over there and do something about it?" Claro finished, glaring a challenge at Evie. Evie froze. The anger struggled within her. She took a deep breath and began to push it back down. Then she stopped. Claro was right. If Haruto wanted to play dirty, why couldn't she? Evie turned and walked back onto the mat. "My turn," she said, loud enough for Haruto and his trainer to hear. Her voice was calm, controlled, betraying none of her internal turmoil. Haruto looked questioningly at his trainer, who shrugged and nodded. Evie stalked Haruto with her eyes as he walked towards her. If he was worried, he didn't show it. They both knew she was the better fighter. They had sparred together before. She beat him, but had never given him a reason to be wary of her. Their first round went as it always did. Evie won, and she won deftly, throwing Haruto to the floor. He lay there for a moment, rolling his eyes as he got back up. As he rose, she studied him. She didn't want to beat him. She wanted to crush him, make it so he was too afraid to hurt her or the people she cared about ever again. She thought of Lubanzi as they circled each other for a second time, forced herself to see him, suffocating on the ground, coughing up blood. Evie allowed angry tears to spill from the corner of her eyes and lunged. The move was sloppy, desperate, calculated. He knocked her aside easily, and she waited until the last possible second before she dove out of the way of his retaliation. This match lasted much longer. She still beat him, but it was a near thing. She acted distracted and allowed Haruto to take advantage of it. As the third round started, Haruto's confidence had grown, and a hungry light appeared in his eyes. It had always been clear how much he hated Evie's superior skill, and now he thought he finally had the upper hand. Evie had to fight to keep a cruel smile off her lips. She waited until she could tell that he thought he had her, that he was about to win. Then she struck. She gave him an opening, and he threw a punch that would have shattered her ribs if it had landed. As she watched his fist fly towards her, she did something that she had never done before. She let the anger out. It surged through her like it had that evening in Singapore, though it wasn't nearly as strong. It had only been building for weeks, not years. She dodged his punch and landed a knee to his stomach. 2 months of heavy training had built her muscles, and her knee sank deep into his gut, followed by a satisfying, surprised oof. Haruto bent double, the wind knocked out of him. She sank a vicious uppercut into his chin, knocking his face up and backwards. As he staggered back, she kicked him as hard as she could between the legs. Time froze for a moment as Haruto's face contorted in pain. He looked like he was trying to scream, though no sound came out. He stumbled, then collapsed to the ground, curling into a quivering ball. But before he covered himself, she saw the red stain forming on the front of his pants, sharply contrasted against the white fabric. She had ruptured one of his testicles. Evie stalked towards him, kneeled down, and whispered, "If you ever lay a finger on Lubanzi or me again, I will rip off the other one." She used the roughest Japanese she knew. Japanese was a language built on levels of formality. How it was spoken showed the amount of respect one held for the person they were speaking to. She spoke to Haruto like he was slime on the floor, like he was nothing. He whimpered, and she felt a swell of satisfaction fill her. This man would no longer be a problem. He knew now that he couldn't beat her, that she would make him pay for any future actions against them. Her rage retreated, satisfied for now. Then their eyes met. Only for a moment, but it was enough for her to see the expression of terror plastered across Haruto's normally stony face. His eyes, for once open and unguarded, stared at her as if she was the most frightening thing he had ever seen. She rose to her feet and took a step backward, her stomach twisting. He had deserved this. He was the monster, not her. But suddenly she wasn't so sure. "Damn, girl," Clarato spoke from behind her. The trainer had walked up to her and was looking down at what Evie had done. "Savage. See, you don't need me to step in and solve your problems. Vor's gonna be pissed. 2 in one day." The creature laughed. She actually laughed, the sound grating against Evie's ears. Evie felt a twinge of revulsion at her trainer's nonchalance. An echo of the feeling landed back on herself. "I suppose we can be done for today," Claro continued. "Go calm down. I don't want to hear any more about this. Understood?" Evie nodded, only half listening, suddenly overwhelmed by conflicting feelings. He had hurt them, and she had done what she needed to make him stop. He would be totally fine in a few hours, once Vor got done with him. That hadn't mattered to her before, not when it was her or Lubanzi getting sent to the medbay. She turned towards the exit and froze at the sight of Hat and Amaya, perched on some equipment a dozen feet away. The pigeons didn't normally attend the physical training sessions. Hat had better shit to do than watch Claro beat your ass over and over again. They must have come when they heard what happened to Lubanzi. She entertained a moment of hope that they had just arrived, that they hadn't seen what she had done. But their expressions made it clear that they had. Hat eyed her. His gaze was guarded and held a flicker of unease. It broke Evie's heart to see him looking at her like that. "We'll talk later," Amaya said softly to Hat, before shooting a guarded glance at Evie and flying back out the door. Hat watched her go, before returning his gaze to Evie. "Back to your room. Now." he said curtly.